Hello, everyone. Let me just say a word of introduction so that those of you who are newer to this concept will understand why we're actually doing it. In general, before we drill down into the specific, the concept of learning together came from a conversation that I had with our Chief Jewish Learning Officer, Bob Lichtman, about 2 years ago, in which I articulated my frustration that as the Chief Executive Officer of one of the largest Jewish federations in the country, I wasn't actually doing very much Jewishly myself. There's a lot of administration and a lot of organization and a lot of supervision, but as a Jewish communal professional and as the CEO of a large Jewish organization, I didn't feel that I was getting much Jewish content. And those of you, all of you who live in this community know, we are blessed with an incredible diversity and wealth of Jewish knowledge and education in the 5 counties, the 90 synagogues, the 65 towns and shtetls that we have that make up Greater Metro West. We are the largest non-city Jewish federation community in the country, and we have so many educators who are thrilled to teach us. And we have gone on this beautiful, enthralling journey these past 2 years to hear from our great rabbis, educators, cantors, to teach us and guide us with their passion on this path of Jewish learning. Let me tell you about today, because today is a special edition of Torah with Dov. It is very proudly presented by our federation and our Jewish Day School initiative to honor the wonderful Dr. Lynne B Harrison's extraordinary and historic endowment to provide STEM equipment to all 4 of our superb Jewish day schools. This generous and visionary gift, which was made through our Greater Metro West Day School initiative, chaired by Paula Gottesman, will advance the study of sciences within the context of superior Jewish education. This all makes, I think, our Greater Metro West community one of the premier Jewish communities in North America. To learn more about this generous gift and the impact it's going to have, I want to encourage you to click on the link that's going to be in the chat and to dive into it in your convenience, but not in the next 55 minutes. Torah with Dov is one of those unique moments in the rhythm of our community where we all sit round a virtual table as peers in our pursuit of Jewish wisdom. So I just want to welcome all of you and particularly acknowledge a few friends, our Federation President, David Sarkanar, UJA Campaign Chair, Michael Goldberg, Jewish Community Foundation President, Steve Levy, our Foundation's Executive Director, Kim Hirsch, Chair of the Greater Metro West Day School Council, Paula Gottesman, our Day School Initiative Director, Rebecca Hinden, Rabbi Lawrence Groffman of Temple Shalom of West Essex, and of course, our wonderful Dr. Lynne B Harrison. They're with us today, along with leaders of our federation and our day schools, and many of you who regularly join us to learn Torah. STEM, I think most of you know, is an acronym for the deep teaching of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Today, I think we should spell STEM with an additional T, STEMT, which represents Torah, the same Torah that's taught with thoughtful integration with the sciences at all of our day schools. And on this Earth Day, we're privileged to learn with outstanding and accomplished students.
No, I had it in my hand.
We're going to ask people to mute, and thank you. Today, we're privileged on Earth Day to learn with outstanding and accomplished scholars from 2 of our day schools. I want you, though, to know that this program today was developed by and is presented on behalf of all 4 of our Jewish day schools as an example of the ongoing collaboration that takes place among them. And our teachers today represent the finest of Jewish and general education that's provided at Gold Oak Academy, Gottesman RTW Academy, Jewish Educational Center, and the Joseph Kushner Hebrew Academy, Ray Kushner Yeshiva High School. So after our study with our teachers for the final few minutes of our hour together, we'll hear some brief words from Lynn, followed by her rabbi, Rabbi Lawrence Groffman, and then I'll get the final honor of thanking you all and everybody. Let's start with our teachers, and let me introduce them for one moment. Dr. Bracha Erblich is a graduate of Brooklyn College who received her master's and PhD in biomedical science with a focus on neuroscience, both degrees from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. During her tenure, she was a research scientist at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, where her research concentrated on the cross-section of neuroscience, immunology, and infertility. Dr. Erblich is currently a science instructor who has inspired students at high schools in California and throughout the greater New York area. She serves as an educational consultant writing curricula, and training teachers at multiple Jewish institutions. Dr. Ehrlich is a recipient of a Hoffman LaRoche Research Fellowship, as well as a National Institute of Health Training Grant Award, and since 2015 has served as the chair of the science department at Brauer High School of the Jewish Educational Center in Elizabeth. Rabbi Yaakov Mintz has been an educator at the Ray Kushner Yeshiva High School since 2006. He served as department chair of the Science and Talmud departments and currently is director of Judaic Studies. Rabbi Mintz holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Yeshiva College, a master's degree in secondary Jewish education from the Azrieli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, and rabbinic ordination from Rabbi Isaac El-Hanan Theological Seminary. He is currently pursuing a master's degree in alternative and at-risk education from Marian University. In his years at Kushner, Rabbi Mintz has expanded the science department that now includes a full range of STEM courses and broadened the opportunities for Torah learning for students. A particular area of interest that he loves to share with his students is exploring the overlap of Torah and science and seeing the beautiful synergy that they create. Dr. Ehrlich, Rabbi Mintz, we're grateful for you both, and we are in your capable educational hands. Thank you.
So hi, everybody. Welcome. It's so nice to see so many faces. And really, this is something that's out of my normal toolbox. I'm used to different kind of classroom environments. So this is just really nice to be amongst so many people who are invested in the system of Jewish education. So welcome and thank you for having us here. And also thank you, Lynn, for all you do for us, both in terms of the science support and on our personal level, you know, all the inspirational conversations we've had over the course of the past 2 years. So just wanted to say that. Okay, so today it's Earth Day. So it happens to be that we picked this topic to discuss prior to knowing it was Earth Day and prior to picking the date. But we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the things that come up with relation to our interaction with the Earth. We're very interested in talking a little bit about the recycling, reusing, and even recreating things out there. So quick story. So in my household for many, many years, we kind of ran a busy lifestyle, and generally speaking, I'll go into the kitchen and my husband will be in the kitchen and we'll be cooking. And I used to go over to the recycle bin and toss basically an item such as this into the recycle bin. And then my husband would promptly remove it and throw it into the garbage can. And this went on for years with us constantly arguing about whether or not recycling was something we should do. Basically, we've settled this argument at this point with him saying, when we get to be less busy, we can talk about recycling again. But so far that has not happened. This talk definitely, and the research that I did leading up to this has led me to think about whether or not that's something we should do. So from a Torah perspective and from a personal perspective, are we really allowed to recycle, or must we recycle? Are we allowed to repurpose things, destroy things, and create things? So just to open up the floor to you guys, taking a quick poll, so you can show me with a regular show of hands or blue hands, whatever you would like. First of all, are we morally obligated to recycle? Raise your hand if you think we are. Do you think we're morally obligated to recycle? Okay, I'm glad so many people agree with me and not my husband. So that's 80% at least from what I'm seeing. What about genetically engineered medicines? Are we morally obligated, or should we genetically engineer medications? The answer to that question, if it's yes, raise your hand. Okay, so we're more 50-50. Should we genetically engineer plants? Raise your hand if it's yes. Fewer, okay, a lot fewer we're dropping here. Should we destroy invasive species? Yes, raise your hand if it's a yes. Okay. Should we reintroduce extinct species? Wow, that one got an almost no. Okay, there's a few yeses. So it'd be really, I see a little bit of this going on too. Okay, so with those stories, with those questions and with this story in mind, I just want to explore what is our Torah standpoint in this over these issues, and how can we approach this? Because really Torah is our guiding light. So are we allowed to create? Are we allowed to destroy? And must we recycle? And from here, I sort of turn to Yaakov to take it away with some of the Torah insight on this issue.
Thank you. So, so as we begin this issue, you know, it's as you mentioned, I love to look at the overlap of Torah and science, and we have to ask ourselves: is this a scientific question? As Bracha was describing this debate that rages in their household, is it a scientific question of what exactly is the value? Is it just an empirical question? of recycling? How much are we saving? What are the damages? Was it a cost benefit analysis that we have to do? Or is there a deeper moral question that we really have to look at in order to be able to analyze the proper outlook from a Jewish perspective, from a Torah perspective on a question like this? So I'll start even from a secular source before we get to the Torah sources. Those of you who printed out the sheets, you'll see source number one actually comes from the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2015, where he says that environmental issues are not merely environmental, but they're actually moral issues. They're an issue of social justice, of human rights, fundamental ethics, he calls them. And therefore, he calls upon religious groups to work in harmony with science when it comes to issues of the environment. That religious groups have to start thinking about this from a moral standpoint, just like every other decision that we make. We have to start thinking about the integrity of the environment in a similar light, that this is not just something that for scientists to deal with, for environmentalists to deal with, but it's actually a moral question in terms of the well-being of mankind. And therefore, these are very serious things to be able to pay attention to. So we'll start from the beginning quite literally, and we'll find some of the sources we'll go through in terms of our obligation to care for the environment. So if you look at source number 2, you'll see the pasuk from Bereshit, Parak Bet, pasuk Tet Vav, Bereshit, Genesis 2:15, where the Torah describes God took man and placed him in the Garden of Eden. And then the phrase that comes up there, which will really be foundational for what we're going to talk about, is L'ovda u'l'shomra, to work the world and to guard the world. So if I may just, before we see the commentary of the Midrash that we're going to get to, if I just open up for a second, those two words that are placed there, L'ovda u'l'shomra, to work the world, to work, to toil, l'shomra, and to guard. What sort of a directive, what sort of an obligation would you say that that's putting upon mankind from the very beginning of creation?
We should use it and take advantage of it, to work it.
Okay, so we have to use and to take advantage to work. So is that idea is that God is giving us, in a sense, would you say the permission or the obligation to?
There's a purpose to, right, there was a purpose to the garden, and it was for us to use for our benefit.
While maintaining it.
That's the second part. Right, to protect.
To protect the gift from God.
Good. So
like a custodian relationship in a way. It's not, there's a guarding element that implies that it's not just, you're not just guarding it for yourself, you're guarding it for future generations, for God, for something bigger than yourself.
So what I'm hearing seems to be that there are two aspects here. On the one hand, God is putting it there for us to benefit from, everything we can benefit from the earth. And at the same time, it becomes our obligation to care for it, right? And perhaps those words, L'ovda l'shomra, really are telling us that, right? We can work the land and therefore gain whatever we can from it. But at the same time, it's not merely there for us to benefit from, but we also have an obligation to care for it. And in fact, if you look at the Midrash, which is well known on a day like Earth Day, when it comes to these issues of environmentalism, in source number 3, you'll see it's found in Kohelet on pasuk there where the directive is to Re'eh Ma'aseh Elokim, to observe the creation of Hashem, and because to observe it, and the pasuk goes further and says, who can repair it if it's damaged? Meaning that we need to take extra care of the earth. And because if we don't take care of the earth, then what will happen afterwards? Mankind, human beings, are the only part of creation who's now able to care for the earth that God placed here for us. And if you look at the language of the Midrash, it says when God created Adam, so even though this is a very different context, here we have it described in the creation of Adam. He showed him the trees and the Garden of Eden. He said to him, look at my works, right? He's the directive to Adam to look around, observe the world as it is. Look how praiseworthy, how beautiful they are. Make sure you don't ruin and destroy the world. For if you ruin it, there is no one to repair it after you. So there we have that there coming up the directive very clearly that what Ovdal Lishama to work the land and to guard the land is putting upon us this obligation to care for it. That once God put it here for us, it's now our job to be the custodians, if you will, to care for the world. So now if I would put out for you, after we have the creation, what sort of specific area of the Torah would you think where this, very often when you study Bereshit, so you have the big ideas of creation, of Genesis and creation. But what specific directives can come to mind when we think of the obligation to care for the world around us? What specific mitzvot, commandments, directives that we have in a normative day-to-day life would be part of this process of taking care of the world? Please, go ahead.
One that comes to mind is kilayim.
Very good. So kilayim is the prohibition of mixing together different species. So that's on here. If you jump ahead, we'll get there, God willing, page 7 or 8. Very good. The prohibition not to mix species the way they were created, to leave them in that form, which is a little bit complicated because they're mixing them might be, Bracha already gave a little of this away. Would mixing of them actually be damaging to the world, or it might actually be enhancing the world? Anything else?
Shemitah.
Okay, Shemitah, the prohibition, the 7th year of leaving the land fallow. That's an interesting discussion, not on the list here, but that's important to think about. People often on Earth Day point to Shemitah as a way of caring for the land. But if we had enough time and we'd be able to look into it, I think that there is more to it than that. But certainly rotation of crops and the similarity to Shemitah, certainly there's an overlap there.
Be fruitful and multiply.
How so?
Well, I think there's 2 implications with that directive, and that is there has to be a healthy world for us to continue to be fruitful and to multiply. And I think the other implication is that we shouldn't over multiply, something that we're also dealing with today.
Excellent. So that question of overpopulation, right? And in fact, the verse we did not quote here, the directive within creation also for man to take over the world and to conquer it, the kivshuha is also together with peruvua, filling the world with people, becomes this tension that we're going to have to get to as we move along today through these sources of how exactly we do this. On the one hand, the Ovda, we're there to use the world for our benefit. On the other hand, to take care of it, like all these great ideas that we see throughout the Torah, being careful of how we mix things, being careful how we use the land in terms of Shemitah, being careful, and then the opposite extreme being, well, let's be fruitful and multiply, take over the world. But at the same time, let's be careful to make sure that we preserve it as well. So I don't want to take up too much time to get into the more of the science that Bracha is going to get to. But one more thing that we did put here in the sources, in source number 4, a specific directive comes up over here in Deuteronomy 20, 19 and 20, Dvarim Perek Chaf, where it describes during wartime, there's a specific prohibition when fighting a war not to cut down fruit trees, specifically trees that bear fruits. We're prohibited specifically from cutting those down. It should be another example we'll have to think about, and we'll see soon some of the sources. But now already we have a picture of this initial directive, and then some of the specific mitzvot that we have that are warning us in different ways of being careful with the way we take care of the world. And obviously in modern times, that takes on a lot of new meaning, how exactly we follow these directives. So I'm going to turn it back over to Bracha to get into some of these specifics for modern times. We'll get back into more sources.
So I thought particularly interesting about the fact that this specific prohibition refers to trees is the fact that we don't think about this a lot, but actually in terms of global land area, I'm not talking about oceans that cover much of the earth. It turns out if you look at source 5, a good percentage of what land is covered with is actually trees, or more specifically forests. And it's so much a fundamental part of what we need for the ecosystem to exist and subsist. So if you take a look, you can see in source number 5 that actually much of Earth's biodiversity is actually found within these forests, which makes those trees so fundamental in every way way to us, not just fruit trees, but actually all trees that are out there. This source, you can see, doesn't even include, it includes amphibians, that 80% of the amphibians of the world are found in forests, bird species, mammals. It doesn't even include the vast majority of what we see in the living world, which is fungus and algae and things like that, that we found everywhere, bacteria that are found in the forest. And actually something to reflect on as human beings, again, referring to Earth Day, turns out that we've lost a good percentage of the forest that's out there. So if you're looking at source number 6, you can see that it's estimated that since 1990, 420 million hectares have been lost. And the interesting thing about this is, what is the primary reason why we're losing forest? Anybody want to take a guess here? You can call out.
Paper, logging, humans.
Human,
Right. So, well, aside from humans, and what human activity actually is causing this loss of forest primarily?
farming.
Okay, so farming, and it's actually in the source, it turns out that agriculture is actually the primary cause of the loss of forests. So this actually is interesting, because this puts us into this position now where we have a source in Torah that's telling us, don't cut down fruit trees, but here we're cutting down forests to create the food for life, which sort of puts us in this position where we have to choose. And I think this is what we're bringing up again about Priravu, the sustenance of the earth and sustaining the human population, while trying to balance it with the needs of the ecosystem and the needs of man to have the ecosystem be intact. So really, what would we do in such a case where we're facing something so complex? So I think Yaakov is going to give us a little bit more about how we can gain perspective about what to do about this kind of a dilemma.
So the one small piece that I'll jump in now to add in is an important Rambam, and then I'll let Bracha get into more of the nitty-gritty of some of the real numbers in terms of the more advanced scientific analysis of what we can do for preservation. And that is, if you look in source number 7, it's a comment of the Rambam. The Rambam in the Middle Ages took all these ideas that we were talking about previously, this obligation of man to preserve the world, and the specific mitzvot that all of you mentioned, and that I believe coming specifically from this aspect of trees that the Torah itself focuses on. And he says as follows, in Hilchot Malachim, it's called Malachim, really, the laws of kings and the battles and the wars that they fight. That's where the Rambam codifies this halacha, this rule of not cutting down trees. But he adds something amazing. He says, we're not only referring to trees here, rather anyone who breaks utensils, tears garments, destroys buildings, closes wells, and wastes food in a destructive manner, which is going to be an operative term here, this destructive manner, in Hebrew, derech hashchata, in a way of destroying, violates the prohibition. So the Rambam tells us that very often, when you have a prohibition in the Torah like this, where not to cut down fruit trees, the Torah is not merely giving you a specific directive about a specific act, but rather it's building for you a principle. It's building for you an idea. It's building for you a value that you're supposed to follow. And the Rambam therefore says, he's teaching us, well, fruit trees are important, right? But that was really meant to be something which is telling us an attitude towards the world. And every time you look at clothing, and every time you look at vessels, and every time you look at a building, you have to say, well, that thing right there, I have the similar obligation to take care of and to guard and to protect that object as well. And therefore, as Bracha goes through these sources, for now, we're going to keep that idea in mind, our obligation, that it's not merely fruit trees. It starts with fruit trees, but it travels, and then it expands itself, I should say, to many, many other areas that we're going to have to look at.
So the modern world, as we know, we have a lot of ways of engaging with our environment, right? So I wanted to just float some of the things that we do. And in light of this idea that destruction is problematic from the Torah, like talk about what are our moral obligations in terms of some of these things that we do. So the very first one I would love to get somebody's thoughts about is basically destruction brought about as a result of mining. What are people's perspectives on that? And that's a very open-ended question. So does anybody think that it's an acceptable act to do in terms of Torah and the perspective on Torah in terms of the destruction piece, and why? Very quiet. Nobody has a comment. Okay.
I feel like there's a catch at the end.
Okay. So Lynn, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to see. I think, again, as we said, there's a balance. There are things that we mine from the earth that are goods for the preservation of, for the continuance of life. There was a time when people would have frozen to death without the coal that they were burning in their furnaces. Freezing to death is not a good option. So much of life is a choice between things that are less desirable and things that are more desirable. And you have to come down on the side of what preserves life, like coal, to heat a home. And you have to try to do it in as non-destructive a manner as possible. You can't just, you can't ignore the obligation to mine responsibly, but you can mine.
Okay, so I think that that's a very good perspective to have here. And actually with mining, there are those really positive pieces of it and then those negative pieces of it. And, you know, a lot of research now focuses on how to mine a resource without causing more damage to the environment than necessary. There are a couple more scenarios that I just want to put out there, and I would love people to give me feedback on this. So I think most of us are from New Jersey. I see some faces that I know are from New York, but for those of us from New Jersey, how many of you are familiar with the Meadowlands region? Raise your hand. Okay, so can somebody describe for me the general habitat there? Okay, call out, go ahead. Swamp. I think I heard somebody say swamp, right? So swamp is, right, swamp, marsh, those are very typical things we have an association with the Meadowlands. Some of us also can say that there was a sports arena there, but we were going for swamp and marsh over here. So now there's a mall, but in essence, the Meadowlands area is a swamp area that right now we do protect because we feel it's a very, very crucial part of the habitat. It actually does a lot of filtration of pollutants that actually come out of the New Jersey area before they enter the ocean. It filters that region. What was surprising to me in doing research is that it turns out that the whole marsh that we protect is what's known as an invasive species. The grasses that were there colonized the area back in the 1600s and completely 100% completely obliterated the forest that actually existed there. That area used to be white cedar. It was beautiful hardwood forest. And now we have this new environment that actually contains all this marshland. And so here we're faced with a choice where we're saying, well, we have a lot of good here. There was a lot of good here. And now what do we do? Do we go and kill this invasive species, or should we let it be because we now have a whole new habitat that's actually functioning in a different way that's really important? This is actually a very big challenge from a scientific standpoint because a lot of the current thought right now is that it is a good idea to get rid of invasive species. But I'd like you to consider that maybe, just maybe, many things were invasive species if we go back 500 years and are now part of the habitat we protect. And maybe we have to reevaluate whether or not invasive species is part of the way the ecosystem actually evolves over time. It's just something to think about. Let's consider another example of something that maybe we should talk about basically destroying. So consider source number 8. Does anybody want to read source number 8? Or at least part of source number 8? So I don't know if anybody's raising their hands. Jerry, do you see anybody? Okay, Jerry, you want to call on somebody over there?
I think Rhonda volunteered.
Okay.
Sure. Rhonda, that would be great. Thanks. The most terrible of all the ministers of death was always present, filling the churchyard with corpses, tormenting with constant fears all whom it had stricken, leaving on those whose lives it spared the hideous traces of its power, turning the babe into a changling at which the mother shuddered, and making the eyes and cheeks of the big-hearted maiden objects of horror to the lover.
Okay. So does anybody know what this is talking about without looking ahead to other sources? Okay. So this is talking about the smallpox virus. T.B. Macaulay was a historian and was writing about the different things that occurred in history. So anybody know what the state of smallpox in the world is right now?
It's nothing. It's eradicated.
Okay, so it's in essence eradicated, with one exception.
Aren't there strategic reserves somewhere?
Right, so
Yeah.
there's the one exception, which is that actually the US and Russia, presumably only the US and Russia, still keep stores of smallpox around. And there's a big debate raging, actually. There was an agreement back, and if you look at source number 9, I'm not going to read through it, but back in 1990, there was a discussion because there was a debate preceding this saying that once we already knew what the viral genome was, meaning we knew the sequence of the virus, we had enough protection to protect ourselves against this virus. And so there was an agreement between Russia and the US, I believe it was arranged in the UN, that those stores would be destroyed. But as of basically the 1990s, we have the sequence and nobody has destroyed the virus. So I pose to you, do we have an obligation to destroy this virus? It's a pretty bad description over there. And that was an easy one. So I see Steven's raising his hand. So love to get your insight.
So,
Your neurology background. So yeah, go ahead.
So, what's interesting about that example is there was a group in Canada about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. They had actually reconstituted not smallpox, but horsepox, based on the published sequence through mail order synthesized pieces of the genome. So the idea of destroying the remaining virus in both the Russian and the US deep freeze has been kind of rendered irrelevant. I think the real difficult question is, should that information, how to synthesize, and they were able to make infectious horsepox, in a relatively low-tech lab. Obviously, they had technical expertise. You're not going to do this in your basement, although I might. The real question is, does that information by itself
Okay, leaves us hanging a little bit.
Yeah.
We lost him.
We also, I think, I think that was Kushner. So,
I think we lost Rabbi Mintz as well. For a
yes,
second.
that's what I was just going to say. I think we lost Rabbi Mintz as well. I mean, I don't want to continue because I think what Stephen Stein was saying is extremely important and very true. I mean, we're talking about also, do we destroy this information? Is the information in and of itself something that needs to be destroyed? A lot of time and effort goes into there. If we choose to destroy it, we're not just destroying the tools that it brings to the table, but also destroying the time and effort that went into this process. So that's, I think, very valuable. Does anybody want to contribute anything else? Because he said a lot of very important things there.
I just get nervous, and forgive me because I don't want to go too deep down this tangent, but when people raise this argument, I always go back to a terrible reductio ad absurdum argument of people saying, well, because the Nazis, Yimach Shmam, did experiments, should we throw away the results of the experiments because that's how science progressed? And I know that's not where you were going. It's just that the implications of this discussion do have some rather, let's say, thought-provoking there are some thought-provoking implications to a statement like that, which could go very drastically dire if you take them to some kind of conclusion.
Yeah, this is definitely, thank you for expressing that, a very complex topic that, I mean, brings up a lot of issues. And you're right, and this is something I think at our Shabbos table we've had debates about also, specifically the one you did, which is information that we get scientifically that was obtained unethically. What do you do with that information too? So I don't want to pivot too far because I think that's a fascinating and important conversation, and an incredibly important point. We have information here, how do we use it? And also, really, do we have an obligation in this case where potentially the evil is to be in the future? Do we have an obligation to destroy something like that, where something can bring such destruction upon the world if it were to get loose? The next one, I'm just gonna, sorry, did somebody say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that also destroying information is nearly impossible. That even if we destroyed it from our known file cabinets and digital file cabinets, we can't ever know that some other person doesn't know it also. So, and that leaves a lurking danger. So the good guys ought to hang on to the information if the bad guys might.
Right, and that's an important point here too. So in an absolute sense, this does leave us with the burning question. Once information is out there, do we have an obligation now to hold on to it, preserve it, so that we can help the world at the same time? Okay, here's another one, different scenario. Should we or can we continue the process of finding ways to destroy the atom? What were the consequences of destroying the atom? So in source 10, we have a very nice description. I think we all are familiar with what happened with the destruction of the atom, right? What was the major event that occurred?
The atomic bomb?
Yeah, the atomic bomb. Okay. So the atomic bomb, if you look basically at source 10, there's a description from John Hersey about Hiroshima and the different consequences that were brought about because of this horrible act. Okay. At the same time, the flip side of this is if you look at source 11, which is fascinating, source 11 tells you that scientifically, if you actually look and include all the nuclear disasters that occurred historically, okay, so Chernobyl's included here, Fukushima, I think they re-looked at it and it didn't change things around so much, but all the nuclear disasters that are out there, even with that included, it turns out that nuclear energy, which comes from the same process and is a little hard to see because it's small, actually is one of the safest forms of energy when you compare it to coal, oil, natural gas, even biomass, which is from bacteria, and even hydropower, which is clean water power like from Niagara Falls. Nuclear energy is one of the safest forms of energy. And at the same time, it's also one of the cleanest forms of energy. Even if you take into account radioactive decay and things like that that are out there in the environment, the amount of pollution and cleanliness that this creates, and again, including the nuclear disasters themselves, it's such a powerful thing. So here you have something where it really becomes a big question. Do we continue with this process or not? So how do we decide again what to consider? And some of this was already brought up in the previous sources, that actually the Torah has this perspective that, and I think Lynn was expressing this, that we need to be balanced in our approach, the gain, the loss from these things. And this has come up through the discussion of these things. Is Yaakov back on? Does anybody know if Yaakov is back on?
Come on, here he is using
Okay.
Dr. Stein's screen. Yeah.
Oh, okay, fine.
Okay. I'm sorry about that, everybody.
Repurposing, reusing.
Yeah, reusing.
There we go. Exactly. So I assume we're up to where we were. I'm sorry, I just have to run upstairs for a moment.
We're up to
12.
12.
12. Perfect. Okay. So now that we've had this, more of a discussion in terms of what recycling is and some of the complexities that, honestly, before Bracha and I started preparing this this program together, I myself didn't have that debate in my house. We kind of just recycle without thinking about it, like most people. And I actually mentioned to some of my students, and they were kind of, really taken aback by the whole notion that, maybe there's something that is even questionable, the value of recycling. But now that you think about it, it really causes us to pause and sort of analyze more what exactly this value that we have and exactly what it is. Whereas the Torah's, the directives of cutting down trees in times of war looks very different when it comes to recycling in 2021. So if we look at source number 12, first of all, would anybody like to read the English there, source number 12? It's really a beautiful piece from the Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch was from the Middle Ages. We actually, the authorship is not known. It's somewhat debatable who wrote it, but it's a certainly well-accepted piece in rabbinical literature. And it's one I think that, this piece can really help us understand. I can't see the gallery now on
Someone volunteer so I don't have to call on you.
Jessica.
Anyone?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes?
Yes, Jessica.
Okay,
go
great.
for it.
Thank you, Jessica.
Okay, you're welcome. The foundation of this mitzvah is known, and that is to teach ourselves to love that which is good and purposeful and to cling to it. And through this, good will cling to us, and we will distance ourselves from that which is bad and destructive. These are the ways of pious people. They love peace and are happy when seeing the good in people, and through that bring people close to Judaism. They won't waste even one seed of mustard, and they are bothered by any waste or destruction that they see. If they have the ability to save anything from destruction, they will try their hardest to save it.
Okay, so Those words. So if I could ask anyone to have a thought or a comment, the type of descriptive language he's using here for this value that he sees within this, presumably what I would have thought is just a detailed, simple mitzvah of how to be a soldier in war. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, my issue is, I guess we're talking about recycling it, and they talk about, the destruction, saving it from destruction, which is different than saving it from repurposing or recycling. So to me, this is not a question, if you hold on to a plastic bottle or a glass bottle, you're saving it from destruction, but you're also saving it from turning it into another plastic bottle or even a bathing suit. So the destruction word is the one that gets me, and so none of this stops me from thinking about recycling.
Absolutely. So that word destruction is actually the next source that's going to be very important really to analyze as well. Any other thoughts before that in terms of how we define this value and how it could influence our attitude, very practical attitude, all the investments of the money and the resources that we put towards recycling, and whether or not that really is going along with Torah values or not?
I mean, we talk about plastic and recycling because that's in the current discussion points. But we could think of it from a much simpler perspective of mulching, of taking herbal matter that no longer has value to us in its original form, mulching it and using it to fertilize the earth for the next season, for whatever you need it for, and thereby furthering the flowering of the earth.
Right. So I think that's really a great way of phrasing this, this attitude and this value that we're having here, where we're not merely looking at simplistically, is this permitted or not permitted, but rather what exactly is this sense of destruction that we're getting to. So if you look at the next source number 13, you'll see a very, very important, someone brought up Shemitah earlier. So Shemitah is the 7th year when we let the earth lay fallow. But more fundamental than that is Shabbat, is every week we have a point where we step back from our normal constructive, creative attitude towards populating the earth and doing all these things to make the earth a better place on our own, being partners with God, if you will, in making the world a better place and stepping back. And the definition of what that's supposed to be is really fascinating. If we look here on source number 13, right? Shabbat itself, which is the culmination, the celebration of all of creation. So when our rabbis define the actions that we take or don't take, so it talks about the acts being specifically those that are constructive, right? So we have an act of ripping, tearing clothing out of anger. So you're tearing the clothing, which is a destructive act, but you're doing it to release your anger, or you do it out of mourning for a deceased person, or any destructive act is exempt. That's not considered a violation of Shabbat. Meaning there's a big difference between taking clothing and tearing it for the purpose of coming out with a smaller piece of cloth, which I now constructed something better, versus doing it in such a way that destroys it. And we already have throughout the tradition this concept that the same exact act can be both constructive and destructive, depending on how exactly we use it. So now, as we go through a little bit more of the details of recycling, so that's important to keep in mind. The same exact act, we're not going to objectively say it's X or it's Y, it's constructive or destructive, but rather we're going to look at it carefully and in the context figure out what if this goes along with our value of taking care of the earth or if it goes against. Bracha, please.
So I think it's safe to say from taking this perspective that really an act of destroying actually can be in certain cases an act of creation, which is a positive thing. And just taking the point that, recycling isn't always about destroying, it's actually the idea is to create again. So I actually have source 14 just to say well, how do we define recycling and what are we actually doing when we're recycling? So I just pulled from dictionary.com source 14, which just says that recycling is actually the conversion of basically waste into reusable materials. So technically composting has that element to it, but we're gonna move away from that because there's a piece of composting that's actually doesn't involve the same complexities as the recycling that I'm kind of focusing on. And just so you know, recycling is actually an incredibly scientifically destructive process. It takes a huge amount of chemicals and intervention to get things back to the form that they're actually in, which is actually, I didn't mention to you, my husband is also in science. So that's why we have this back and forth all the time. This is not a normal conversation that everybody should be having in their household. So if you should feel good that you're throwing things in as is sort of explained is useful in that way. But basically, what we see is that doing this process can have a very positive effect in the environment, because although we are doing something destructive and chemically altering, the idea would be that it'd be valuable if what we got out of it at the end was a net savings of the environment, a net savings of resources and things like that. And that would be something that, from what we're seeing from the Torah sources, certainly would seem to be in line with Torah values. But there are some things that make this system incredibly complex. Ideas that maybe people don't realize is when analysis of recycling is done, a lot of times different factors are taken into account. Most of the time, they're really weighing the economics of what it takes to harvest the goods from scratch versus reuse it, and also the carbon footprint per se, like how much carbon emission is out there. But it turns out that if you really actually research recycling, it turns out there are a lot more factors involved here. So there's a big debate as to whether or not overall recycling helps or hurts the labor force. In other words, the construction labor force versus the recycling labor force. It's incredibly energy intensive. The disposal of the waste products from the process of recycling cause tremendous complications. And something that people don't take into account really is the fact that most recycled products are transported over vast distances, because most of the countries such as the US, European countries actually recycle their products offshore in countries that are far away and don't necessarily have regulation of these materials. They'll transport at large distances, which is very intensive on the energy cost of the process. And also there's a lot of corrosive products involved, extensive amount of time. And we talked about the fact that time is a valuable asset to us as humans. And then the costs are very, very high. So the question then becomes really, what's the deal with recycling? So it turns out if you do a full-on analysis of a lot of the different costs, it turns out that actually, and it's hard to see this graph in source number 15, you can see right here, this is looking at aluminum. If you look at the statistics here, you can see that in general, the percentage of all aluminum materials recycled over here is pretty small. It's about 45%, but the total saved energy as a result of it is almost 100%. So metals, as it turns out, is incredibly productive recycling. The same is true for basically newspapers and things like that, although very little is actually recycled of it. This gets much more muddled when we talk about glass. So it turns out, in terms of metals, I'm right, my husband wasn't so on par, so he's going to now start recycling metals. Glass, on the other hand, is very interesting. Turns out glass actually is more toxic to recycle in every capacity and more labor intensive than actually putting it into a garbage dump. Turns out that glass is not recycled frequently, and the gain, if you look at this chart over here, is not much. And it turns out the cost of recycling glass is actually worse for the environment. And also in terms of the toxicity, when it decays, it doesn't produce equally toxic things. Now, plastic is the big one. Plastic is a bit of a mess. So it turns out that we need to think about what is going on with plastic. As it turns out, it's an extremely complex story. And turns out we have huge amounts of it in the environment, which you guys all know. So this is values in megatons. This is source 16, 8,300 megatons of plastic that actually is in our environment currently, of which a very small percentage is actually recycled. So anybody know why that is? Okay, so it turns out that there are.
Wait, I think Michael Goldberg.
Michael knows.
Oh, so I didn't see.
Michael knows.
I can't see.
Because
both
it takes
screens.
more energy to recycle it than it is to just to throw it away. And it's
Correct.
not biodegradable. That's why it ends up in the ocean. So I have one question for you, because I know
Go
it's
ahead.
coming to the end, and we talk about teaching and the practical and the moral aspect of recycling. But when you go to the Kushner Academy cafeteria, are we composting? Are you is there plastic bottles in the refrigerator for water bottles and other things like this? I found it very built when I went to see my son at Washington University in St. Louis, and they had a very good recycling program with composting, and they had water in cardboard containers and other things. And you also, one of the things you mentioned about the tin and aluminum is we pay for that. So there's a reward for recycling that because it's so valuable to recycle certain products. So what we teach morally, what do we do practically? And that's what is very, because you don't want someone to learn this in school and then go to the Kushner cafeteria and find out, oh, but there's water bottles here.
And if I could just add, Dr. Erblich, the factor that Michael brought up was the ocean and the plastics in the ocean, right? So there's no way, this chart is very nice. It measures energy, it measures, toxic, but, what's the impact of all the plastic in places that are, because it's not being recycled. So there's these other impacts that you really can't measure.
Correct. So it's a very complex discussion, obviously. There's not even a question about that.
Can I jump in for a moment, if you don't mind? About the cafeteria in the school. It's Ellie Rubin here. We replaced this year all of the water fountains in the school to encourage students to use the recyclable bottles and reusable bottles. So it should be bio-sustained, and the fountains are filtered, and it counts for the students how many bottles we've saved with every usage. So we've really thankfully been saving thousands of bottles of plastic every day throughout the year because of these new water fountains that we put in school.
So I think because time is short, I'm going to skip around and actually follow up that statement, because I think that that's a very good point. And one of the interesting things, if you have time on your own to look through this, is that the reason why we recycle plastics in the first place is that there was a general ban that was put in place back in, there was a movement to ban plastics, I believe it was in the late 1980s. And there was a big movement on the part of the petroleum lobby, who is the main lobby that is responsible for producing plastics, because it's actually a petroleum-based product. And they started the movement to really push forward the recycling movement in full force. And one of the articles that I read, and it's not in here, talks about the fact that actually on some level, us doing recycling, as opposed to what Rabbi Rubin was, it's Rabbi Rubin, I wasn't sure it described, is that we sort of pat ourselves on the back and say, good job, because we put it in there. We can only break down, out of the 7 forms of plastics that are out there, we can only effectively really break down 2 forms of it. And even when we break it down, some of those products still end up in the ocean. And some of what we're doing when we recycle is we say, good job. But in reality, what we really need to do is cut down or come up with a different solution. So plastics is a hard one. It's not an easy scientific question to answer. It's not an easy moral question to answer.
So Bracha, if I may, because time is short, so I want to just kind of give I think it's actually an appropriate way to end. Those who have time can look at our last sources, and that is really looking towards the future. And I think really it's what we're celebrating here, this gathering, and having STEM education for the future, because all of these questions are going to become more complex. And if you look at the sources, you'll see the science is advancing so quickly in terms of genetic engineering and modification, and being able to come up with new ways of preserving the environment. And because of those, the value questions of what exactly is appropriate in terms of preserving the environment, and when are we overstepping our bounds. If you have a chance to look at the last sources over there we brought up earlier, in terms of mixed breeding and how we apply that, those are the really questions that us, and God willing, our children, who now are putting in a position to be able to tackle these questions. As technology continues to advance, we're really able to look back at our ancient wisdom and be able to use them, God willing, moving forward. So I want to turn it over now to Dr. Harrison to be able to share with us some thoughts as we conclude, and thank everyone for their participation, and especially Dr. Harrison for everything that she's done in making all this possible for us and for our students.
Thank you very. Am I muted? No, I'm not. Okay. First of all, thank you all very much. A real special thanks to thinking of honoring me by a Torah study. That's maybe more kind of honor than I deserve, but I'll take it. I'm thrilled that my family could be with me, and so many of you whom I consider dear friends. Dove spoke of the fact that we are a great federation and should have a Torah study. Our federation is possibly the premier federation. I know I say this with bias, in the United States. We've given incredible amounts of leadership on a national level. Just think of Clary Risen, Murray Lewin, and today our own Mark Wilf is head of the Federation. But even more than or parallel with leaders we've given have been ideas. Paula and Jerry Gottesman of blessed memory were the first in our country to look at the middle of the middle class and their inability to afford quality Jewish day school for their children. And Kim traveled the country seeding this idea in other federations. But through our Jewish Day School Council, we do incredible amounts of tuition assistance, which enable families to send all of their children to a good Jewish day school. A good Jewish day school without a quality education, affordable though it may be, is worthless. So also through the Goddess's Initiative, we have our Quest for Excellence teacher conferences. And I looked at I serve on the council, I looked at everything we do, and there was one element which was missing. You learn science by doing science. And particularly in this last year with the amount of resources that have gone into COVID remediation, equipment is sadly lacking, a budget for equipment is sadly lacking. And that's what my endowment is meant to do, to provide everything from computers and printers, centrifuges, incubators, calibrated pipettes, the things that the schools need to continue the excellent science programs they have. So, thank you all for joining us. I would much rather hear Rabbi Grafman and what he has to say than keep talking. So Rabbi Grafman, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you all. Especially Yeshar Kochech to Dr. Erblich and Yeshar Koch to Rabbi Mintz for your wonderful, wonderful teaching. Really wonderful and beautiful and really thought-provoking. So thank you. What a joy personally for me to learn from you today. So here's a STEM question. Get out your calculators. What do you get when you add a dedicated, knowledgeable scientist plus a dedicated, knowledgeable Jew? All right, you don't need the calculator. The answer is Lynn. And today's beautiful shiur, this beautiful lesson, really was the perfect way to honor Lynn Harrison and her deep commitment to education, to science, to Jewish education, and the well-being of Klal Yisrael, the entirety of the Jewish people, and of course to the day schools in our community. As the parent of a day school student at Golda Ach Academy, I'm a big fan. And I'm greatly appreciative, Lynn, of what you've done specifically for Golda Ach and for all our day schools. They are a precious, wonderful resource. And I have to say, I'm honored and proud that Lynn calls Temple Shalom of West Essex and Cedar Grove her spiritual home and has for more than a quarter of a century. And Lynn, I am proud to be a rabbi. And it is such a blessing to have you in our community and our congregation. I know I speak for our entire Temple Shalom family and community when I say to you, thank you. For all that you do to make our congregation and our broader Jewish community stronger and better, and for always helping us to fulfill our sacred mission of fostering Jewish literacy, Jewish spirituality, and Jewish community. Yeshar Kochech, Lynn, and may you always go from strength to strength.
Thank you. Dev, you're muted.
I am muted, as usual. You would think I'd figure out how to use Zoom by now. Don't worry, we've got a couple more months of doing this. As usual, as is our tradition on Torah with Dov, it's badly named, but here we are. We never finish. There's always more that we're thirsty to learn. I want to take the opportunity to thank my colleague Jerry Russo, who is our Day School Initiative Program Manager, for all her help in putting today's session together. For our teachers, for my colleague Bob Lichtman, to all of you, to our leadership, to our supporters. This is an ongoing, experiment is the wrong word, this is an ongoing endeavor that all of us are invited to be a part of. The idea was not that Dov is taking you on a Torah journey, it's that here I am, come along with me. And I'm really blessed and honored that you were with us today. I hope that we will get to see you very soon on another occasion. Keep in touch with us. We got your number. We know how to get in touch with you too. Happy Earth Day, Chag Sameach, as we would say, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you, and thank you, Lynn. We love you.
Thank you.
Feel free to unmute. I'll leave you on for another minute or so for chatting, and then we'll call it a night. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Lynn, that was beautiful, and I learned a few things.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. I'm
Yeah,
glad.
it was wonderful, but now you have me
And by
concerned.
the way, something there was no time to say for, but 3 of our brilliant day school students in Kushner are actually working on this plastics problem. They are in the midst of having patented a biodegradable plastic, which can be a film, which can be a solid, and which will indeed biodegrade all by itself. We won't need recycling plants. It's going to be amazing what we see come out of the minds of our children. And, you know, a really big Yasher Koach to Paula and Jerry of blessed memory. Nobody would have faulted Paula if she had, their kids went to school in what was then Hebrew Academy, what's today Gottesman RTW Academy. But Paula and Jerry really, really internalized all Jews are one, all Jewish children are all of our children. And they led the way to making this endeavors that cover all of our Jewish catchment area, irrespective of denomination, irrespective of geography, and so on. And it's inspired many of the people who, using Paula and Jerry as role models, have been making contributions to our community to make them for all of our day schools. I don't fault anyone for singling out a single school, but it's wonderful when they can collectivize and do it for all of our children in all of the schools.
Thank you, Lynn.
Beautifully said. Paula, I hope you're listening.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Federation.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank
And
you,
Lynn,
Lynn.
thank you
Bye-bye.
again.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful
Bye,
to see
everybody.
you. Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks, Lynn. Terrific.
Thank you for
Thank
hosting.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you.